Chapter 13. When Addison finally opened her eyes, a good hour later, she was feeling very disoriented and still a little nauseous. The sounds around her were too loud and the light too bright, the smells mingled, and the fabric covering her skin was itching. It all made her feel very, very sick. She groaned, putting a hand on her forehead, trying to focus on one thing at a time. She narrowed her eyes in an attempt to limit her partial blindness and looked around. She recognized the white walls and the 6 beds in the school infirmary. Yeah, they had a lot of beds, but cheerleading sessions could lead to a lot of injuries, and there were over 30 of them on the team. You had to be sure there was enough room for each of them. A movement on her right side made her head spin sharply before she relaxed as she recognized Bree's fruity scent. She had raised her hands in front of her in a sign of peace when she saw her move, her brow furrowed. Addison frowned even more when she realized she had recognized her friend by the smell rather than by seeing her. Addison. The girl snapped out of her thoughts and smiled at Bree, who lowered her hands, considering that she was out of danger. Bree. Addison tried to stand, but another voice held her back. Take your time, cheerleader. We are not in a hurry. Addison turned her head to see Eliza on the other side of her bed. She smiled at her before narrowing her nose. Her sweet zombie scent had never felt so strong. She shook her head a little in an attempt to get past it, before smiling at her again. The 2 girls walked over to her and sat on either side of her bed. What happened? Addison asked. She remembered her headache and cough, then Wyatt's warm, soft arms before she passed out. You were very sick. The wolves tried something, and you got better, explained Eliza. Addison raised an eyebrow. That wasn't an explanation. There were plenty of holes. Why had she felt bad? What did the wolves do? What aren't you telling me? Bree squirmed a little before sighing. Your necklace is missing, and it looks like its absence made you sick. Addison raised the other eyebrow. How is it possible? I have lived my whole life without wearing this necklace, and I have never felt so nauseous. We don't know, but the wolves had to give you another one, Eliza continued. It was pretty amazing when you think about it. When Willa put it around your neck, you calmed down right away. Willa told me it was the only necklace that was still charged. Sorry. God, why did they do this? This necklace was not for me. Oh God. Addison mumbled under her breath, not believing that they gave her the most precious thing they have. Her grandmother had, of course, told her about the Grand Alpha, without ever going into details. She had just explained to her that the wolves were looking forward to their coming, and that they kept a very special necklace for this person. After getting to know wolves and figuring out what was going on with their own necklaces, it hadn't been too hard to make the connection. Addison. The young girl jumped and instinctively pressed her hands on her ears at Eliza's cry. She turned to her and cocked her head to one side, seeing her slightly frustrated. We've been trying to get your attention for 5 minutes. You were completely out, Bree explained. Addison felt bad hearing the worry in her friend's voice. Could you explain to us what's going on? Finally asks Eliza, taking her hand once calmed down. Because I know that you are close to wolves, but Willa, Winter, and Wyatt were so worried. It looked like they are more than just acquaintances. Addison closed her eyes, but she knew she couldn't escape it. Her friends had seen too much, and they were worried. They had seen her pass out so that only a wolf necklace could revive her. I've known the existence of wolves since forever, she said finally. My maternal grandmother talked to me about them all the time. At first I thought it was just stories, legends. But one day I met 3 children by a river. Addison told them everything that had happened that day, then the letters they had exchanged until her grandmother died, and the necklace they gave her in their last letter. She had never worn it before that year, but had always kept it close to her. She kept it at home when she was in town, and she took it to cheerleading camps with her. The day she saw the wolves in the forest, after the accident, she decided to start wearing it all the time, a sort of discreet rebellion against her mother's decisions. When she was done, Addison watched her friends' reactions closely. Eliza had raised her eyebrows but kept a smirk on her lips, while Bree had her mouth open. She finally pulled herself together with a big smile on her lips. I see. Now I understand better. No wonder you're always so open-minded. It helps to have wolves as best friends. My grandmother made us promise not to say anything, even though the whole pack knew about it without us knowing it. Addison smiled. But that doesn't explain why you got sick when you didn't have your necklace anymore, Eliza intervened. Addison sighed and stroked the metal shell that enclosed the stone with her fingertips. She didn't understand either, and she was afraid of the answer she might get. All I know is that this necklace was meant for a very special person. The fact that the wolves gave it to me makes me nervous and worried. Bree opened her mouth to say something when the anti-monster alarm sounded. Alert! Monsters detected at Seabrook Power Plant. Alert! Monsters detected at Seabrook Power Plant. It was at this precise moment that Addison noticed that wolves were nowhere around her. Her eyes widened and stood up abruptly. Don't tell me they went to the power station without me. My dad will think they're trying to overtake them. Eliza, please tell me that the wolves didn't go to the Central. I thought your father had agreed to help them? Cried Bree. Yes, but he will not pass the opportunity to show them who is the strongest. He would be able to put them in confinement to establish his authority, while wolves do not care about human authority. That's why I wanted to be there, to avoid this kind of situation. She pointed at the red siren that lit their faces. Bree and Eliza exchanged a look. They nodded and turned to their friend again. What do we have to do? Addison Eliza asked. Addison thought for a moment. We're going to need everyone. We have to separate. You each try to get the largest number of people together. Convince them, talk about the cubs who are about to die, remind them of the discrimination against zombies last year. We must all be united to defend the wolves. The two girls nodded and got up from the bed, before helping Addison to do the same. The shrill sound of the alarm ached in her ears, but she ignored the pain and concentrated on her mission. The three friends parted ways, and Addison ran to the auditorium. The debate had just to be over, and she was sure to find as many people as possible. She absolutely had to convince them. She stormed in through the glass doors and stopped dead when she saw the scene unfolding before her eyes. Zed stood by the benches, looking sad and worried, clutching his wrist. Addison noticed that his bracelet looked messed up and sighed. On the other side, there was practically the whole school, including the zombies. They were looking at Zed with a frightened look. Addison. The girl turned to her cousin, who was hiding behind Lacey. Run, don't stay there. The zombie is dangerous. Wow, you haven't changed your record, dear cousin. You've been saying the same thing for a year. Addison crossed her arms and shook her head. He has just entered into a frenzy, Casey shouted. He will attack you. Addison raised an eyebrow and looked back to Zed. Zed, are you going to eat me right away, or are you back to yourself? The zombie looked at her surprised before responding quietly. I'm fine, Addie. My bracelet is working again. Great. Now we have more important things to deal with. Addison walked over to the podium and grabbed a microphone. Bonzo waved to her that everything was okay, which she thanked with a smile before starting to speak. 10 minutes ago, the alert went off. We know, we thought it was because of Zed, Zara shouted. No, it's not Zed. The werewolves have broken into the powerhouse. Addison rolled her eyes at the frightened looks of her audience. Looks like not all of his speeches had reached everyone's brain yet. She sighed and decided to use another technique. Oh my God, a zombie! A being who devours brains whenever it can, she cried, pointing to Isabel. The girl frowned. And another, and another. Addison started pointing fingers at every zombie she could see from where she was. Even humans seemed puzzled as to what she was doing. Addison, you know we won't hurt you the slightest bit, Elsa said at last. How would I know? All the stories are clear, though. You were going to brain eat me and party around my body, right? But you know these legends are false, Rita cried, taking Zarek's hand. Is that so? Yet these are legends that everyone has heard, right? That everyone believe. That does not mean that they are true, Lori replied. And the ones with the werewolves are true. Addison let go of the scared human act and looked at them hard. She crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow, not smiling. She saw the looks exchanged between zombies and humans. She saw the doubt that settled in their minds. But they're mean to us, Alexander tried. They growl at us and try to scare us all the time. And believe me when I tell you that they have an excellent reason for that, Alexander. Humans have stolen their source of energy which they need to live. Without it, they are doomed to die. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't feel very kind to the descendants who put my life and the life of my family at risk either. Addison saw some nods and smiled. We were finally heading in the right direction. Well, they can die, Bucky shouted. It'll be one less threat. You're not serious. There are children who are sick. Children the age of your little sister, Aaliyah. Children younger than your sister. Do you really want to condemn children who haven't asked for anything? Addison saw Bucky's confused look at his little sister's name. He adored her and would do anything for her. If it was your brothers, your sisters, your family who were in danger, you will stop at nothing to protect them. Why would the wolves do otherwise? Wolves didn't hurt us. After all, Zed said at last, they only want to be able to be themselves and to survive. We didn't welcome them with open arms either, so why would they bother to be nice to us? And, well, we had a lot of fun during the cheerleading session, right? In the end, everyone was chatting and no one cared if they were wolves or zombies or humans, Isa continued. Gradually everyone nodded, and even Bucky seemed to agree. Addison smiled. There might still be hope with him. We have to go to the power station. I don't trust my dad not to take advantage of the situation. We have to go help the wolves. Together we will be heard. We are the new generation of Seabrook, an open-minded generation, Addison said, raising her fist in the air. Everyone screamed with her and followed her out of the auditorium. She found Eliza and Bree, who had gathered the little that had not gone to the debates. Addison saw all those people and smiled. She took the lead of the group, and no one noticed the necklace that glittered around her neck, meeting her determination, much less saw her eyes glistening with blue light. It was time to change things permanently. Chapter 14. The trip to the powerhouse was both the longest and the shortest that Addison had ever made. She felt the wind in her hair, heard the beating of her heart which pounded at the sound of the footsteps of the 100 or so students who surrounded her, drops of perspiration falling from her forehead and wetting her back. But none of this mattered to her. She had a mission and she intended to complete it. Soon night fell and the streetlights light on, and they saw from afar the flashes of light from the anti-zombie squad. The trucks cut off the main entrance, but Eliza led them through a side one. They emerged right in front of the squad, and Addison was close enough to hear her father speak. Silver handcuffs. It'll train those monsters. Addison felt the rage stir within her at her father's disgusted tone. Hadn't he understood anything from their conversation the day before? Or maybe had he just pretended so that she did not interfere? She glanced to the side to see the handcuffed pack near the fences, their faces contorted in pain from the silver. It was outright torture, and she couldn't believe it was her own father doing this to children her own daughter's age. No. Addison ran to the central plaza in front of the adults. These adults who didn't understand anything about life. These adults, each as intolerant as the other, when basically it was the fault of humans that everything had started. If their ancestors hadn't stolen the Moonstone, the werewolves wouldn't have been so wary, and the zombies would never have existed because the accident would simply never have happened. Addison. Her father seemed surprised to see her, and she even thought she saw a hint of fear in his eyes. Zevon, Zed's father, was also present, and looked more confused than anything else. Addison remembered Zed telling her that her father was the demolition chief, but he didn't seem to know about her deal with his father. How dare you? I trusted you, but as soon as I turned my back, you imprisoned my friends. You put the lives of children of your daughter's age, your niece's age, on the line for a simple matter of pride and fear. Addison. No, I don't want to hear a word of what you can tell me. I trusted you. You promised me you would postpone the demolition until we could find what the wolves were looking for. But you tried to trap me. You tried to kill my friends. You never listened to me. Neither you nor Mom had listened to a word of what I said, right? Addison felt the tears start to roll down her cheeks, and silence fell around her as she screamed the words her heart had carried for far too long. She had given them a chance. She had believed that maybe they could change if given the opportunity, but obviously she was wrong. For you, as long as it is different from you, you are not happy. Well, breaking news. We're not alone in this world. We're 7 damn billion inhabitants, and we're all so different from each other. We don't exist alone. And it's high time that you put that in your head, and that for once. Instead of going headlong into a situation that will make you a murderer, a child abuser, you behave like an adult." She glanced at the other adults, who looked as speechless as her father. "Look around you. Last year it was the zombies that were treated this way. Last year we sent a 15-year-old zombie into confinement when it was the human's fault that he had gotten out of control. But have the responsible humans been punished? No, here. We have the same situation. It is because of humans that wolves find themselves here, having to fight for their survival. Adolescents my age must behave like adults because no adults are there to guide or protect them. If it was your own children, your own family that was on the verge of death, you would have used any means to save them. How are the wolves so different?" Addison wanted to say more, but her sobs cut her voice, and soon she had to turn away to hide her tears. Everything she had said, she meant it, and it was high time it was said. She couldn't stand this lousy injustice any longer. It was time for these so-called adults to grow up and look at the world around them without that pink filter. She felt Eliza's hand on her shoulder before she addressed the crowd herself. "As for me, I'm talking to you, zombies. We fought last year to have our rights recognized as being the same as the citizens of Seabrook, because we are citizens of Seabrook. But we hesitated to come to the aid of the wolves, who are nevertheless going through the same ordeal that we went through for fear that we will be deprived of even more privileges and freedoms. And that was our first mistake. We should have come to their aid, because we would have wanted someone like Addison, to come to our aid when we needed it. Silence does not mean abstinence. By remaining silent, we chose a side, and we gave them the power to do as they pleased, if we had listened to the wolves from the start. More than that, if we had given them the impression that they could ask us for help, we wouldn't be where we are today." This situation, she pointed to the imprisoned wolves, the school students behind her, and the adults in front of them, is our fault above all. So it would be time for us to correct our mistakes, and to dare to use our voices to express our disagreements. Eliza was silent, and through her tears, Addison saw a few adults nod their heads and move away slightly from her father. On the other side, she could see the worried but proud looks of her wolf friends, and she gave them a small smile. She was going to get them out of there. "Dad, I know you care about this new job, but it's not the right solution." Addison turned her head to see that Zed had approached the front of the stage, his gaze pleading but determined. "You know our history as well as I do, and you've seen all the changes Addison has been able to make in our favor. But we got lost, and I was the first to change. We were so afraid that things would go back to how they were before, that we would be discriminated against and mistreated, that we tried to change what we were to be less zombie and more human. But this is not the right way to go. We're zombies, Dad. And it will be our whole life. Wolves might be aggressive and a little bit wild, but at least they know what they are and they're not looking to change. And we were like that before, proud of what we were." He gave a big smile. "So it's time to get back to it. We're zombies, and we're proud to be. Who's with me?" Everyone cried, even the wolves. Addison wiped away her tears and turned once more to her father, who seemed defeated and resigned. She approached him despite the growls of the wolves behind her. "Dad, you have always been a fair person. Do you really think what you're doing now is fair? Technically, they're all minors, and you're torturing them. Where is my daddy who read me stories at night, who hunted monsters under the bed and in the wardrobe so I could sleep peacefully? When was he replaced by this pale copy that lets his fear speak and not his reason?" Addison felt her speech finally touched her father. His shoulders slump, and he sighs. Her eyes softened, and for the first time in a year, Addison didn't see the slightest hint of fear or anger there. Only a gentle tune that turned into a determined tune. "All right, Addison. You won. We're going to free the wolves." Zavon in turn smiled and cried out to be heard over the cries of joy and relief. "Tomorrow we'll remove the explosive charges and we'll find what you're looking for. For now, I want everyone to go home. The site is dangerous and could explode at the slightest bad minute." Addison smiled and hugged her father, letting out a cry of joy as he motioned for the guards to release the wolves, who hugged each other with their free hands and smiled and laughed unrestrainedly, far from the smirks and grimaces that Seabrook High School was used to. Addison saw from a distance the surprise in the eyes of those who had never seen beyond their claws or fangs, and smiled when she saw Matthew come up to Wyatt and hold out a hand, which the wolves eyed suspiciously. Wyatt glanced at her, and she nodded, still smiling. He sighed before smiling too and taking the outstretched hand. From there, Everyone mingled, and the adults took it upon themselves to start pulling them away from the demolition site. The brigade went first, and the students whose parents were a member of the patrol returned with them. His father stayed behind, knowing that Addison wanted to hang out with his friends a little while longer, and that they still had a lot to say to each other. The small group of friends walked out of the demolition site with renewed energy. "You were awesome," Addie. Zed laughed, wrapping his arms around his shoulders. "Not as much as you, Zed. I'm glad you finally saw that you didn't need to change to be accepted." Addison smiled at him and squeezed his arm before taking Eliza by her other arm. "And Eliza, you finally had it, your revolution." "I would have liked more fighting, but it was quite satisfying." She laughed in turn. Addison laughed too before Zed let go of her arm and turned to her. He had a guilty look and no longer dared to meet her eyes. Addison frowned and walked over to take his hands. She felt more than she saw the wolves stop behind them, and Elias retreated back to where Bree and Bonzo were. "Zed? What's wrong?" The zombie let go of her hand and plunged his hand into his pocket. A thread of leather came out, which he unrolled to show Addison's Moonstone. She breathed in sharply and gave him a big smile when she recognized him. "My necklace." She turned to the wolves and smiled at them. He found it. She took the necklace in her hands and grinned at the comforting weight against her palm. Then she hugged Zed. She was going to be able to return the Great Alpha's necklace to the wolves, and they were going to be able to keep it safe for the right person. Except that Zed pushed her away slightly, causing Addison to frown. What was he taking from him? "I didn't find it, Addison. I took it from you when you looked away this morning." "Zed?" He sighed. "I didn't want you to change, Addie. You look more and more like a werewolf, and that scared me. I'm sorry, Addison." The young girl did not know what to think. She understood what Zed was saying, but she couldn't believe he had dared to use his self-confidence to steal something that was dear to her. He didn't know how important the necklace was to her. Even more so today, since it seemed like she literally needed it to live. "Addison," he begged. She raised a hand, telling him to shut up so that she could think about it. She knew the right thing to do would be forgive Zed. He had confessed and had apologized to her, and she didn't want to lose her friend. She sighed and ran a hand through her hair. Her gaze fell on Bree and Eliza, who looked angry and worried at the same time, then on the wolves, who were frowning and about to show their teeth. They didn't seem happy at all. Willa had a hand squarely on Wyatt's shoulder to keep him from jumping on Zed. She ends up turning back to Zed. He still had his eyes downcast and his fists clenched. He was already angry with himself. She sighed again as she made her decision. "I forgive you, Zed." He looked up, his eyes hopeful, but she kept looking harsh. "But I don't trust you anymore. You can't steal other people's things just because you're afraid they might change. I thought we had already had this discussion. I'm 16, I'm going to change. It is obligatory. The one I am today will not be the one I will be in 10 years, in 20 years. A necklace won't change that." Zed nodded, and Addison smiled. "It doesn't mean that we won't be friends anymore, but you're going to have a hard job so that I can trust you again." She turned to the wolves. "I got my necklace back. You can take this one back. I know how precious he is to you." To her surprise, Willa shook her head, smiling. "Keep it, Addison. It's yours now." "What? But..." "Oh, we insist." "You need it more than we do," Wyatt interrupted as he approached her. "It will prevent what happened this morning from happening again." He took her hands and led her gently backwards towards the pack, never taking his eyes off hers. Once in front of the wolves, Addison raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" "Addison, it's necessary," Wyver replied. "Who knows how your body will react if you switch back to a nearly empty necklace?" "Keep it," Addie Willow continued. "Now that we have the Moonstone, or close to having it, everything will be fine." The other wolves nodded their assent, and Addison smiled at them. "Okay, but if I keep this one," she pointed at the necklace around her neck, "then you get this one." She handed her old necklace to Willa, who smiled back at her. Wyatt had quietly walked past her and put his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her hair. Addison rolled her eyes at this typical wolf behavior, but let it be. "What do you say, wolves? Do we accept her deal?" Willa called. The screams rang out and startled anyone who hadn't heard the conversation. Addison laughed as Willa let her smirk fall into place. "Looks like everyone agrees." The alpha took the necklace from her and gently wrapped the leather ties around the stone before putting it in her pocket. Addison smiled as she snuggled closer to Wyatt, not noticing Willa and Eliza's smirk, Winter and Bree's happy ones, and Zed's sad but resigned gaze. Then suddenly, all the good humor vanishes. "What? What do you mean it doesn't work?" The teens turned to see Zevon and a zombie in work clothes behind them. Her own father was getting closer to them. "The remote control has been damaged. I can't stop the timer." Zevon cursed and rushed back to the construction site. Addison exchanged a look with Willa, before following him despite her father yelling at them to come back. But no sooner had they arrived in front of the entrance than several explosions rang out. Everyone covered their ears from the loud noise, and Addison felt Wyatt pushing her behind him to protect her from the debris. Then suddenly they saw the building collapse. Addison screamed, as the wolves behind her began to cough and collapse. She had to support Wyatt and saw Eliza rushing over to Willa. She turned to see the fire and dust from the explosions and ruins. Chapter 15. No. Addison's scream was deafening and muffled the sound of wolves coughing violently, their necklace glowing with a sick green light. She fell to the ground, one arm held by Zed, who had run towards her when she screamed. Tears flowed from his eyes. She wasn't sobbing, she wasn't screaming. Her tears just flowed softly and silently. And oddly, this silence was worse than the cry she had uttered. She didn't hear Zevon scream to get out of the ruin field. She didn't hear her father approach, his phone stuck in his hand, calling for help. She didn't hear her friends screaming and protesting. She didn't hear the wolves howl in despair and sadness. All she heard was the sound of the detonations, which would deprive her of her friends, of her family. She looked down and closed her eyelids, hoping it was all a horrible dream. She did not want to face this reality and still preferred to deny it. She had lost everything in a matter of seconds when she had promised that she would help them, that she would be there for them. "Addie, it's not your fault," Wyatt whispered to her, kneeling beside her. She opened her eyes to plunge her blue eyes into the wolf's chocolate irises. In a matter of seconds, it looked like he had taken 10 years. He gave her a small smile, which only increased Addison's sobs. She freed herself from Zed's grip and threw herself on Wyatt's neck, who hugged her tight against him as she wet his sweater with tears. She felt Willa and Winter surrounding her from behind, inhaling her scent, as she did the same, comforting herself as best she could that they were still there with her. She didn't see her father watching her, his eyes wide, or Eliza and Bree exchanging knowing glances. She just wanted to stay close to her friends. They ended up separating without completely letting go. Addison took a deep breath, knowing that the decision she had just made was going to be strongly opposed, but she also knew that it was the best thing to do for the survival of the wolves. With a fluid gesture, she grabbed her old collar, which protruded slightly from Willa's pocket, who barked in surprise and took off the big alphas. She tied the almost empty necklace around her neck and immediately felt the effect it had on her. She felt weaker and flinched for a moment. She would have fallen if the arms of her 3 wolves weren't around her. "Addison, why did you do that?" cried Willa. The young girl smiled at him as she handed her the Grand Alpha's necklace. "You need it more than I do. You need to be able to take care of your pack. Take it, Willa." "No, Addison. It's yours," Wyatt protested. "Then I'll lend it to you. I'll lend it to you until we find your stone." The wolves exchanged a puzzled look. Even her human and zombie friends didn't seem to understand what she was saying. Addison herself didn't understand why she had said that, before realizing it was exactly what she was thinking. "Until I turn over every stone in these ruins, I won't give up. I refuse to give up. I won't be satisfied until I see with my own eyes that it's all over. But Addison, the Moonstone," started Eliza, "is only buried. It's a magical object. I don't think a simple landslide can overcome it," she interrupted. "Honey." Addison turned to her father, who had approached and gave her an icy look. "If you had followed our agreement, we wouldn't be there now. I'm not saying it's all your fault, but you made a huge mistake. An error that I am ready to repair." She turned to the wolves, their ears twitching to listen to what she had to say. The dynamite sticks that exploded were positioned on the columns outside the building. The interior and basement may be intact. The history books say the settlers hid the power source, but they still had to be able to use it. So why not in the basement of the plant itself? The more she spoke, the more Addison realized that she really had a point. Addison's right, but it's too dangerous now Zevon intervenes. There may still be charges intact, and they must be diffused before attempting any search procedure. It may take several days. Go home, go get some rest. If there is anything to be found under this rubble heap, it will be found. Addison met Willa's gaze, who nodded once. "All right, Zevon, we can wait a few days. Come on, let's go home." Addison freed herself from her 3 wolves and staggered a little. She really felt weaker, but didn't want to worry her friends. She straightened up then and walked steadily to the forest. All the other students had already returned home, only the wolves remained, and her small group of friends. Her father will be home late because of the demolition fiasco. She turned to her friends. "Do you need anything?" "Whatever." Winter smiled at her and walked over to her before licking her cheek. "That's sweet, Addison, but we're strong, tenacious wolves. We will hold on. Go home, and we'll meet again soon." The girl nodded softly, as Willa approached her as well. She hugged her, whispering a thank you, even though Addison didn't understand what she was thanking her for. Then she let go, and began to go with Winter deeper into the forest. Wyatt moved closer as well, and with a graceful movement of his arms he pulled her up and slammed her against him, inhaling the scent of her hair. Addison grabbed his jacket and dug her nose into his neck, inhaling too. She loved the forest smell that emanated from Wyatt. She felt like she could roll around in it all day and never get tired of it. She felt safe, and didn't want to let go, knowing that he felt safe with her as well. But eventually he pulled away a bit and leaned towards her ear. "Thank you for everything you have done for us." "I haven't done anything special though," she whispered absently. His mouth lightly caressed her earlobe, and she couldn't concentrate too much. She shivered a little and leaned more comfortably against Wyatt. He stroked her back up and down, and Addison relaxed a little more with each back and forth of his hand. Then reluctantly he pulled away from her and kissed her forehead, before smiling at her one last time and running to catch up with his sister and her friend. Addison stood there staring into space until Bree jumped on her. "Bree? I thought you were already gone." She gave her a mischievous smile before taking her arm to pull her away from the forest. Addison reluctantly let her do. She wasn't sure why, but she felt drawn to the woods, or by what was hiding there. "Bonzo is escorting me home, and we thought it was best not to leave you alone. If Willa was right, and you're weaker because of the nearly empty necklace, I wouldn't want you to fall apart without anyone knowing." Addison took a quick glance behind her friend and saw Bonzo smiling at her as he gave her a small wave. She smiled and shook her head, but ended up letting them walk her home. Bree pulled her a bit to walk in front of the zombie and gave her a big, mischievous smile. "So? Between you and that handsome werewolf," she finally asks. "Who, Wyatt? What's wrong with him?" Addison raised her eyebrows, looking puzzled. Bree rolled her eyes and huffed a deep breath. "Don't tell me you don't feel anything for him, especially after this little moment not even 10 minutes ago. For a second I thought you were going to run after him when it's dark and the forest is still dangerous." Addison stopped short and turned to Bree, who was looking at her in exasperation. Did she really seem that close to him? Not to mention the fact that he growled whenever someone came near to you. Especially Zed. He really didn't seem to like Zed approaching you. And you should have seen him when you passed out this morning. He absolutely didn't want to let go of you. At this point, she remembered well that it was Wyatt who held her when she eventually passed out, but she didn't think he had been so protective of her. Addison felt flattered, and a small smile appeared at the corner of her lips. She looked down, her cheeks flushing with happiness and embarrassment. "And the number of times it has entered your personal space without you making him leave. On the contrary, you nestly without any concern against him. So don't tell me that nothing's going on between you. I won't believe you." Bree turned her face to her, with a pout on her lips. Behind, Addison heard Bonzo let out a chuckle. She rolled her eyes, smiling too. And yet, nothing is happening between us. We are just great friends, and wolves are all very loving in nature. It doesn't necessarily mean something. But that doesn't mean you don't feel anything for him, does it? You're having ideas, Bree. Come on, we're near my place. I can do the last few meters on my own. Go rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. See you later. Addison gave the couple a final wave and walked towards her house, her head lowered. She thought about what Bree had just said to her. Of course she loved Wyatt. He's always been that protective wolf, even when they were just kids and couldn't see each other. He worried about his family and, strangely enough, for her too. He made her laugh, consoled her when she felt bad, and let her hug him, as if he knew she hadn't had a lot of affection in her life. She loved it when he called her little flower. She loved his smell. She loved that smirk he had every time he teased her. She loved his little kisses on her forehead. But that didn't mean anything, right? After all, Willa and Winter were doing the same thing. And she loved them the same way, right? So why did she feel like she was lying to herself? Her mother was already in bed when she opened the front door, still lost in thought. She moved as quietly as possible, not wanting to wake her, and got ready to sleep. After 10 minutes without falling asleep, she groaned in frustration and closed her eyes. She couldn't worry about that sort of thing now. The Moonstone was more important than her supposed feelings for Wyatt. When it was all over, she would analyze what her heart was telling her, but for now, she didn't want to have false hopes. Inside, she knew that thoughts like that proved in the end that Bree was right, that what she felt for Wyatt was more than friendship, but she really couldn't focus on it. Now was absolutely not the time. She eventually fell asleep, dreaming of the chocolate eyes of a howling wolf at the full moon. The next day she woke up early and decided to prepare a batch of muffins for the wolves, to cheer them up and to give them a little sweetness in this hard phase of their life. They had loved them the last time, after all. Her parents watched her as she stirred in the kitchen, chocolate filling the room. Her mother watched her with furrowed brows and puckered mouth in confusion, as her father's eyes gave off a sadness that Addison had never seen before. She saw him open his mouth to say something, before closing it. "The muffins are for the wolves," he finally asks. Addison responded with a simple, while checking to make sure the muffins were done before putting the second batch in the oven. Wolves? Why would Addison bake muffins for these monsters? Her mother exclaimed. She turned to her father, eyebrows raised. "Because they are my friends, they're living very hard times and they deserve a little comfort. I can't do anything more right now, and that frustrates me, but I hope this little attention will make things less hard on them," replied Addison without turning her head. "Honey, there." The speed at which Addison turned to her parents startled them, and the coldness with which Addison looked at her mother made her shiver with horror. Who would have thought that her little girl had all this rage in her? "Mom, I swear if I hear you or say, you or Dad, bloodthirsty monsters, I'm leaving this house. And so good luck playing the perfect families." Addison. "Dear. No, I'm sick of you treating my friends like that. You say you are my family, but my only family, the one who accepted me as I was, who never asked me to change to meet the compliance needs of this dumb town, is Mommy Winona. How could such a tolerant and open-minded woman have such a cold daughter? I will never understand." "Darling, of course we love you," her mother tried, approaching her, both hands raised as if to calm a wild animal. "No, Mother. You like the image we give. If you really loved me for who I was, you would never have asked me to wear a wig all my life. You would have accepted my friends, or at least you would have made them not feel uncomfortable in our house. You would never have put the anti-monster laws back in place when you knew half of my group of friends were zombies. And more than anything, you would have listened to me when I told you that we should have heard what the wolves had to say to us, and that they surely had a good reason to reappear when they were perfectly happy to be forgotten by Seabrook." Addison took one last look at her mother before meeting her father's eyes behind her. Then she turned to the oven and took out her muffins. She let them cool a bit while she was preparing a box, before putting everything inside. She put the box in her bag and glanced at the clock. She won't be able to take the muffins away now, but she will drop by after her shopping session with Bree for their gown for the prawn. "I'll be home late tonight. Don't wait for me for dinner." Then she left. She walked to the entrance to Zombieland, observing the smoke coming from the not yet fully extinguished flames, and sighed. She was sure the Moonstone was intact, not quite sure how, but seeing the ruins reminded her of the wolves' cries and howls from the day before. She hoped she could do something for them. More than bring them some simple muffins, but for now she had to be content to play her part of a normal high school student. After the prawn, on the other hand, nothing will stop her. She swore it on her name, Addison Katrina Wells, granddaughter of the proud Winona Moonslava. Chapter 16. So, have you thought about what we said yesterday? Bree was holding her arm as they walked out of their biology class. The exam luckily hadn't been too hard, especially since she hadn't revised as much as she should with everything that had happened over the past few days. She had to be careful. She couldn't let her grades go down if she wanted to get a merit scholarship. Maybe it was a bit early to think about it, but better to do it early than to run after time once in her last year. She sighed and nodded. And I decided not to worry about that until we find the Moonstone. Once we get it, you can cut off my ears with your guesses. Bree laughed, making Addison smile, and shook her head. Okay, I'll give up for now. Are you still up for our shopping night? Addison nodded. But I have to go through the den, and I would like to avoid going there at night. Don't worry, Addie, we'll find you the perfect dress, and you can go play with your darling wolf. I even devote myself to bringing your dress home to make sure you don't ruin it with a branch or something. Thanks, Bree, you really are the bestest friend in the world. Addison ignored the comment on Wyatt and smiled as she wrapped her arm around Bree as they walked to their next class. She looked around and sighed, realizing that she was right, and that the wolves hadn't come. Zed neither, by the way. He must still feel bad from the day before. Addison forced herself to think of something else. She wouldn't ruin Bree's day even if she was still very worried. She would see the wolves soon enough anyway. And Zed will eventually reappear when he feels better. So she smiled as Bree told her how Bonzo had walked her home the night before, and for a few hours she behaved like a 16-year-old girl, and not like the adult she had felt obligated to be for the past few months. The day passed very quickly, and the evening shopping with Bree had gone well. Her friend had convinced him to buy a pretty strapless blue dress, encrusted with faux stones. She looked very princessy, but Addison loved it anyway. Bree bought a pale pink dress, which looked almost white. It looked wonderful with her dark skin. The two girls agreed to meet at Addison's to get ready the next day, before Addison finally made her way to the forest. Lucky for her, she still remembered a little of the way, and she hoped not to get lost. She walked through Zombie Town before completely out of town and into the woods. Little by little, the trees became denser and hid the light of the moon, which came out after a couple of hours. Addison was using the flashlight on her cell phone, which she luckily had thought to load in the dress shop. She should have enough charge to make it home safe and sound. She walked slowly, being careful not to catch a branch in the hair or trip over a root. She didn't want to ruin the muffins by falling to the floor. After a good half-hour of walking, she stopped to catch her breath. She closed her eyes as she took a deep breath, feeling the fatigue that had come over her since she had changed her necklace come down once more. She jumped when she heard a growl not far away from her and decided to get back on the road. She didn't want to attract more wild beasts than was strictly necessary. A few minutes later, Addison froze. She was sure she had just passed that tree. She shook her head and recovered. She couldn't be lost. It was very bad if she got lost. The most important rule her grandmother had taught her was to always know where the exit was. It was what differentiates a stray piece of meat from a human. A rustle of leaves made her turn abruptly onto her side, and she didn't have time to do anything before she found herself on her stomach, a weight on her back, trying to keep her from moving. But she was not yet blocked from her limbs. She dug her hands into the dirt, making sure it had a good grip, and prayed that the muffins would stay intact. Then she lifted her pelvis, throwing the thing off her back, and slid her feet over her head in a sort of roll. The thing was not expecting it and found itself thrown onto his back. Addison didn't waste a moment. She stood up and turned to see what had attacked her, ready to run if necessary. She froze when she heard a voice she knew well. Ow, that hurts. Wyatt? Addison rushed over to him and lifted his head to rest it on her knees as the wolves came to their senses. The force of the impact against the ground wasn't enough to take his breath away. He was stronger than her physically, but it couldn't have been pleasant. He winced as he tried to stand, but Addison grabbed him and forced him to lie down. "No, stay lying down while you come to your senses. But why did you scare me like that?" Addison hadn't expected him to open his eyes at once, and especially not with the glint of anger that made his yellow eyes glow. "Why did I? What are you doing walking in the forest at night? Wild animals hunt at night, and you could have died." Addison was speechless at the fury caused by Wyatt's worry. He got up to look her right in the eye, his brow still furrowed, his mouth wrinkled, and his irises still amber. She finally sighed and gave him a small smile. "I know it wasn't the best idea of the century, but I was sure I could find my way back to the den. I wanted to hear from you, especially since you didn't come to school, which is totally understandable considering what happened yesterday. But I was worried, and I made muffins and—" Wyatt looked at her with raised eyebrows before cutting her off, shock still in his voice. "You baked muffins, and decided the best thing to do was bring them to us in the middle of the night." Addison shyly nodded. She knew it wasn't her best idea, but she was so worried. Wyatt ran a hand over his face, his moonstone going out, and let out a laugh and then a sigh. "By the moon, Addison. You're going to give me white hair before it's time." Wyatt removed his hand from his face and gave her a small smile as he stood up. He held out a hand to help her do the same, and Addison smiled as she accepted his help. He didn't let go of her hand afterwards, but squeezed it a little more against him. "Don't scare me like that anymore, okay? Next time, wait for the day. It won't be any less dangerous, especially if you got lost, but at least you'll be sure that we'll be awake, and we can come and get you." He pulled her in a direction, which would have been the opposite of what she would have taken, and began to guide her through the branches and roots. "What were you doing outside?" she finally asks. He smiled at her and walked over to a small hollow in a tree. He brought out a small woven basket which he opened to show her its contents. There were strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, berries and fruits. The pups asked if it was possible to pick some, and after all that happened, we didn't get the heart to say no to them, with Willa. She stayed in the den to take care of the sick wolves, and I went out to get some berries. Addison felt her heart sink. The pups, kids who weren't even old enough to play, might die, and it was all her fault. She felt Wyatt take back her hand and looked up at him. He was smiling tenderly at her, his free hand stroking her cheek. "It's not your fault, Addie. You could not have known. Come on, I'll take you back to the den." He took the basket back in his hand, but continued to hold hers. A quarter of an hour later, she recognized the assembly of stones that formed the entrance to the cave of the wolves' den. He howled at the entrance, then entered. Addison thought to herself that he had surely announced that he had come, so that the others wouldn't take him for an intruder. He helped her walk over the stones of the cave until he reached the smooth part of the floor, which marked the proximity of the living room. Addison blinked as the bluish light dazzled her after spending so much time in the dark before looking around. We were far from the festive atmosphere from 2 days ago. The wolves were all bundled up in the blankets, coughing every now and then. She saw the wolf cubs huddled together in their little nook, watching Willa move from wolf to wolf to wolf to wolf at his worried eyes and whimpers that escaped from time to time. Addison inhaled sharply when she understood something. If all the teenagers were sick, the pups would be on their own. She felt tears rise to her eyes as she imagined children as young as 10 years old having to support themselves on their own. And she promised herself that as long as they hadn't found the Moonstone, she'll take care of them if Willa couldn't. The alpha turned her head in her direction, nose to the air and eyes closed. She had just picked up her scent with Wyatt's. She opened her eyes and gave her a small smile. "Addison, what are you doing here? And what's this smell that I smell on you?" The young girl approached the wolf and took her in her arms. Willa plunged her nose into her neck and inhaled deeply before walking away. "I was worried, and I wanted to get you something. It's not much, but I thought it might cheer you up," she explained. In the middle of the night. "Addison, the forest is very dangerous." After dark, Willa frowned and narrowed her mouth. Addison let out a nervous little laugh. "I know, but I was really worried. And don't worry, I managed to push Wyatt away when he tried to scare me." "Push Wyatt away." Willa glanced over the girl's shoulder and smiled. Addison didn't know what she had seen, but seeing her like that made her happy. She slid her bag in front of her and opened the zipper, letting the sweet smell of chocolate tickle the wolves' developed sense of smell. She took out a large bin, closed her bag, and put it on the floor. "I made muffins. You seem to have liked them the last time." Addison didn't even have time to finish her sentence as she found herself surrounded by wolf pups with hung tongues and being super excited. The teenage wolves had also opened their eyes and slowly sat up at the word muffin. She saw Winter come out of the hallway to the bedrooms, pale skin and collar still giving off that luminescent green light. "Wow, I see. Looks like I really had to bring these muffins," Addison smirked. "Let's say a little softness doesn't hurt," Willie laughed weakly. "And then, we really love these muffins." Addison shook her head gently and opened the box. She knelt down to be level with the cubs, who were looking at her with lively eyes. "You each take one, and if there is any left over after everyone has taken one, you can refill yourself, okay?" "Yes, Addie." "No problem." "Okay." Addison smiled at them and let them take a cake before heading over to the sick wolves. Something odd happened. To each wolf she gave a muffin to, he would take her hand, kiss it, before bringing it to their foreheads with a little howl. Willie was the first to do so, and Worry the last. She then walked over to Winter, who hugged her, before making the same small gesture. Then Wyatt and Willa, who knelt completely after the hand kiss. "Willa? What are you doing? Get up." "Addison, I will never thank you enough for the love and support you give to my pack. You feed us and protect us, you are gentle and compassionate, and you do not judge us." Addison eventually stopped squirming, before seeing that all of the wolves, bar none, were in the same alpha position. She blushed and again tried to escape Willa's grip to force her to stand up. "I don't know what to do to thank you for your kindness and your gentleness towards us. We are in debt to you." Addison couldn't take Willa's ceremonial tone anymore and collapsed to the ground next to her. The wolf still looked down, but that didn't stop her from speaking. "Willa, I did what I did because it was the right thing to do. I couldn't let you die. I had to do something, and even now, when all seems almost lost, I want to help you in my smallest measure. These muffins are nothing more than something to cheer you up. I don't want a debt. I just want you to be better and happy." She turned to the pack as she said these last words, and smiled when she saw the wet look some wolves were giving her. "Get up, you're sick, and kneeling like that is not going to do you good." She grabbed Willa's elbow and forced her to stand up with her, before directing her towards one of the stones so that she could sit down. Wyatt was the second to get up and walked over to her, smiling tenderly. Winter walked up to her and gave her a kiss on the cheek, which made Addison smile. Gradually, all the wolves got up, and Addison helped them one by one to sit up, to be comfortably installed. She took the opportunity to put the box of muffins in one of the recesses in the wall for anyone who wanted another. She stayed in the den for an hour, looking after the children, entertaining them while Willa and Wyatt took care of the other wolves. She laughed and played with them, even though she knew she couldn't pull them away from reality for long. She ends up looking at the time on her phone. "I have to go," she said finally. "I'll take you home," Willa replied. Addison nodded, knowing she didn't really have a say. It was the alpha speaking, not his friend. Willa watched as she put the now empty Tupperware back into her bag and said her last goodbyes before guiding her out of the den. They were walking in the woods, Addison paying careful attention to the path they were taking so that she could come back on her own afterwards, before Willa suddenly stopped in front of her and turned around. "Willa." Addison couldn't see her face well with the shadows of the trees, but she could see very clearly her eyes, which were shining from the tears she's holding. The wolf finally pounced on her, and Addison hugged her, whispering comforting words while stroking her back and hair. It must have been so hard for her, taking care of the pack at 16, seeing the adults leave one after the other, having to be strong, having almost no shoulders to cry on because she had to be that shoulder for the others. So Addison let her drain her fear, her anger, her resentment. She let her clear her mind, focusing on her scent and the warmth of her body against hers. She felt Willa hide her head in her hair and took a deep breath before finally letting go. "I don't have the words to express how I feel. Thank you," Thank you 1,000 times for what you have done for our pack over the past few days. We're friends, Willa, that's natural. And even if you hated me, I would still have come to your aid, because you are innocent people who don't deserve to go through this because of our mistakes. Addison smiles. Willa smiled, before taking her hand. She didn't let go until she got to her house. The lights were out, and Willa gave her a wicked smile before lifting her into her arms and jumping to her window, which had been open since the day Willa, Wyatt, and Winter had first come to her house. Addison had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming, and sighed once her feet were on the ground. She gave the wolf an exasperated look, who just shrugged her shoulders. I'll leave you now, Addison. We'll meet again after your weird ball. Above all, enjoy your evening, she whispered to her. Addison just nodded a little stiffly, before watching Willa jump out of her window again. She rushed over to see her go, until the trees and the shadows of the night hid her completely. She walked back to the center of her bedroom, and while getting ready for sleep, she couldn't help but think that something was going to happen soon. Something that would change her life forever. She prayed that night, her eyes fixed on the full moon, hoping that this change would be a gift, not a curse. Chapter 17. Addison didn't see the wolves at all the next day. The school was closed to finish the final preparations for the prawn, and so that the students could have time to prepare. In the evening, Addison had her mother doing her hair and makeup on and dressed in her blue dress, before her father took a picture of her with tears in his eyes. Addison rolled her eyes but smiled anyway. It looked like her parents hadn't figured out that she was going to go through this for another 2 years yet, and Addison couldn't help but find it cute, despite everything that had happened the days before. Her parents had made many mistakes, both in her education and in managing their new community, but it was their fear that put those words in their mouths, their fear of change. Could she really blame them when they themselves had been brought up that way? Addison felt incapable of doing so, because after all, they were still her parents, and despite their mistakes, she loved them wholeheartedly. She was going to have a hard time forgiving them, but she could never stop loving them. Addison smiled at them one last time, before her father took her to his car. No way she would soil her dress, after all. Bree was already waiting for her at the front doors, and literally threw herself on her once within arm's reach. Addison, you are sublime. This dress really makes your eyes and hair stand out. You too, Bree. This pink dress looks great on you. They laughed, arm in arm, before heading to the ballroom, which was only the converted cafeteria. They passed the cascading curtain, and Addison's eyes widened at the enchanted scenery before her. She really felt like she was standing under the sea with the blue light, the giant jellyfish made out of balloons, and the curtains of water. The buffet tables were to the side, to leave as much space as possible for the dance floor. Bree pulled on her arm and dragged her towards members of their cheerleading team. And despite the fact that Addison was worried about wolves and didn't want to come a week ago, she found herself laughing and having fun, enjoying the moment. Half an hour was spent just chatting, before the movement of the water curtain that hid the entrance caught her attention. Her eyes widened, and she put a hand to her mouth as she saw wolves and zombies pass one after the other, in formal wear. The wolves gathered near one of the small platforms, and Addison saw Wyatt help Winter sit on it. Bonzo pulled back the curtain and ran over to Bree's house with a smile on his face. Briska. Bree looked at him, smiling tenderly. Larzi can. Yes, I agree to be your date. Bonzo hugged the girl and lifted her up into the air, before leading her onto the dance floor. Addison smiled, happy for her friend, and couldn't help but glance at Wyatt, quickly looking away with a blush when she noticed he was already looking at her. Her gaze was attracted by Zed, who entered in turn, followed by her cousin, who gave her a dark look. He walked over to her, and she waited, with a small smile on her lips. Addison. Zed. Did you bring everyone back? She pointed at the wolves and zombies that mingled a bit with the crowd. Behind the zombie, she saw Liza and Matthew hug, before the young man spun her around, making the young zombie laugh. Addison smiles at this scene. They deserve to be happy. We're monsters, we don't have to follow the rules, replied Zed with a smirk. My mother is going to be so mad, but it's so good to have all your friends with you. She hugged Zed, who also burst out laughing at his enthusiasm, before pushing her lightly. He saw something over her shoulder, and smirked sadly before releasing her completely. "Anyway, I hope you have a good evening. Maybe you could reserve a dance for me later." Addison smiles in turn. Zed had come to understand that despite his flattering interest, she didn't feel the same way for him and respected her desire to remain only friends. "Of course," she replied, squeezing his arm one last time. He gave her a last smile before going over to Eliza, who was chatting with members of her computer club. Addison smiled before starting to walk over to the cheerleading members. She didn't have time to take 3 steps when a hand circled her wrist. This time she didn't turn her fist in the air, knowing she was relatively safe in the ballroom, but she jumped anyway before Wyatt's peculiar forest scent filled her nostrils and let her relax. She turned to see him, a small smile on her lips. Addison handed it back to him before hugging him. "I'm glad Zed managed to convince you to come," she whispered into the fur of his tuxedo jacket. "Me too. I will have regretted all my life to have missed such a magnificent sight," he replied. She looked up at him to find what he was talking about, and blushed when she noticed his gaze fixed on her. She pulled away a bit, never really leaving his arms. "Are you all doing okay?" Concern was reflected in her voice, and Wyatt smiled a little sadly at her. Definitely, this evening had a bittersweet taste. As good as can be. "This evening will be good for us. I'm just a little worried about the pups left alone at home, but I know they know how to take care of them." Regardless, Addison noticed the nervous look Wyatt gave the exit, as if he was just waiting for a reason to go see them. She squeezed his hand, turning her attention back to her. She smiles at him. "I'm sure everything will be fine." Wyatt smiled at her too before taking a deep breath. He glanced behind her. What did they all have to look at behind her, before lifting one of her hands to kiss the back of her knuckles? "Addison, would you do me the honor of being my date at this ball?" The young girl opened her mouth and widened her eyes before blushing. She looked down to observe Wyatt under her lashes, a small smile on her lips. She had imagined this scene 1,000 times in the past 24 hours, despite the order she had given her brain to stop, because it was not the time at all, but she never would have believed that her wish would come true. She saw Wyatt's smile sag a bit at her silence. Addison definitely couldn't leave him waiting. She opened her mouth to respond, but at the same time an earthquake shook the whole room, knocking a few appetizers to the floor and causing incredible panic. Wyatt tightened his arms around her to keep her from falling before pulling her towards the rest of the wolves to lean on the platform. The shaking continued for a few seconds before stopping. Willa barked something at the others she didn't understand, but suddenly she walked down the hall, the wolves following her. "Go take cover," Wyatt ordered her before following his sister. Addison rolled her eyes before following them. She knew that Zed, Eliza, Bonzo, Bree, and a few other humans and zombies, whom she only knew by name, other than those on the cheerleading team, were following her closely as well. It seemed to her that even the ACs were there. She must have hallucinated. They arrived just behind the wolves in front of a huge crevice in the ground which let in a purple light. Her collar reacted and began to glow with a bluish light. Around her, the necklaces of the other wolves also seemed to light up. Addison walked around all of the students, leaning slightly towards the hole to try and make out where it might lead. "It's the same signal I got at the power plant the other day," Eliza cried, tablet in hand. Willa turned to her suddenly. The wolves had been so mesmerized by the purple light that they hadn't noticed them. Addison saw the frustrated look Wyatt gave her from afar, but she looked at him with just a small innocent smile and a shrug. As if she wasn't going to follow him when that shock had nearly destroyed his school. Think again. "It must be the Moonstone. This tunnel should lead us to it," Willa exclaimed. Addison wanted to protest. It was far too dangerous, especially if the concrete pieces were unstable. Another jerk nearly knocked them all down, and Addison opened her mouth to tell them to stop and let the professionals do it when she saw something in their eyes. Hope. They had found hope again, and she couldn't take it away from them. So she closed her mouth when Willa stepped into the hole first, followed by Wyatt, who helped Winter down. He met her gaze, once again very clearly asking her not to move. But once the last wolf had passed, she turned to her friends. "We can't let them do it alone. It's too risky." "I can direct us thanks to the signal from the stone," suggested Eliza. Addison nodded, and was the first to follow the wolves. They were already out of sight, but she trusted Eliza's hacking skills to guide them, even if, at the end of the day, the strange light already made a very good guide. Addison took out her phone anyway, and used the flashlight to see where she was stepping. Now was not the time to step on the wrong piece of concrete. Little by little, they moved forward, until they came to a large opening. Addison could hear Willa's voice, who was counting to 3. She heard a creak, then a collapse. There aren't enough of us. Addison passed the opening at this point. Then it would be time to enlarge her pack. She ignored Wyatt's frustrated and worried gaze and turned to her human and zombie friends. We'll help them. Each of you take a piece of metal and hurry up. The room is unstable. Addison moved between Willa and Winter and firmly gripped the metal bar that protected the Moonstone. She felt drawn to her at the time before realizing that her necklace wanted to be closer. It wanted to be stuck on the purple surface of the stone. Addison winced in the attraction, before pulling herself together and counting to 3. But by the time she said 3, another jerk nearly knocked her off and a bit of asphalt blocked their only exit. By the moon, cried Willa. Eliza looked around and her gaze fixed on Zed. Zed, your bracelet is still broken. Maybe you can use your zombie strength to get us out of there. But what if I get out of hand? It's not going to happen, Zed. We all trust you, Addison said, choosing to forget Eliza's remark for now. Since when was his bracelet broken? The zombie met her blue eyes and seemed to see something there, as he nodded before taking a deep breath. With one hand, he took off his bracelet. Addison's eyes followed the dark veins on his skin, and his eyes grew even redder, but after a roar, he huffed loudly, before turning away to grab the piece of concrete with both hands. With a cry, he lifted it up. Addison didn't waste a moment. Let's go. He won't last long. Everyone grabbed a piece of the Moonstone wire mesh and lifted it up. Addison marveled at how easy it was to carry something that weighed a ton before smiling. Teamwork is truly a superpower. They quickly walked through the opening held by Zed before setting the stone down in the hallway. A collapse made them all jump, and turning around, they saw that the opening had once again closed. Zed? Addison took a few steps forward, trying to make out something despite the darkness in front of her. Then she saw an object glow with a green light, and sighed in relief. Zed appeared a moment later, dusting his costume. Zed. She ran to him and hugged him before letting Eliza and Bonzo do the same. She smiles for a moment before turning back to the others. We'd better move on before something like that happens. Willa nodded at her, and everyone walked back to the Moonstone. Little by little, they managed to lift it, and to make it cross the long corridor which passed under the city, between the old Seabrook Central and their high school. Arriving at the opening in the hallway, Addison smiled when she saw that other students were waiting for them, worried. When they saw the giant stone in their hands, some came down to lend a hand and gently lifted it up. Once on the untouched floor of their high school hallway, the screams of joy resonated, and Addison hugged Bree, happy that finally everything had gone well. They brought the Moonstone to their ballroom, and Addison smirked, thinking it fit in well with the rest of their decor. They dropped her in the middle, and Addison barely had time to breathe before Willa, Wyatt, and Winter hugged her. It was super risky what you did, but damn, I'm glad you did it, the Alpha told him. Although next time, I beg you, stay safe, Wyatt asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Winter gently licked her cheek, making Addison chuckle. Isham, I'm not making any promises, replied the young girl, laughing. She felt Wyatt shake his head behind her and winked at Willa in front of her. She turned in Wyatt's arms, who was smiling tenderly at her. And by the way, I accept to be your date. The young wolf burst out laughing, as Willa and Winter laughed and howled to tease him. Wyatt stuck his tongue out at them before leading her onto the dance floor. They swayed gently, just enjoying the other's presence, Addison's head resting against Wyatt's shoulder, and Wyatt playing in her hair. We wouldn't have succeeded without you, he said at last. Addison looked up and gave him a small smile. When we are all united for the same cause, nothing is impossible. Look around you. A week ago, we were all divided. A year ago, we were even more so. and now everyone is laughing and dancing, regardless of whether it's with a human, a zombie, or a werewolf. This is the real magic. Addison sighed in relief as she felt Wyatt's arms close a little more on her, and closed her eyes, letting herself be carried away by the melody. Until Willa came up behind her and patted her on the shoulder. Addison turned and smiled at him. "Addison, as promised, now that we've collected the Moonstone, I'll give you your necklace back." Willa: "Don't say no, Addie. It was a unanimous decision. We all want to see you with that necklace around the neck, make you an honorary member of our pack. And what better way than to reward the one who helped us find the Moonstone and bring it back safe and sound?" "Say yes, Addie, please." Winter came up to her alpha and gave her puppy's eyes, the ones Addison could never say no to. She smiled before running a hand behind her neck to untie the necklace that was already there. Willa smiled before approaching her to put on the new necklace. It shone with a very strong light before fainting, dazzling those who were nearby. Addison immediately felt stronger, and her senses grew again. Instead of a vague smell of forest, she could smell pine, raw rock, damp earth, and lemon on Wyatt's skin. Willa smelled pretty much the same, except that she smelled more like grapefruit. Taking a deep breath, Addison realized that all wolves smelled like earth and rocks, with a slight floral or fruity difference. Zombies also gave off a scent of their own, something incredibly sweet, which made him squint before he could make out the smells of rusty iron at Bonzo, metal at Eliza, and glass at Zed. How could she smell glass? Glass didn't have an odor, did it? Willa smiled at her as she quietly reconnected with reality and walked away with Winter in the direction where Bree and Eliza were chatting happily. Addison had the feeling that the alpha knew what was going on, but she didn't want to ruin her evening. Wyatt pulled on her wrist a little, turning her attention back to him. He smiled at her before spinning her around, catching her even closer to him if that was possible. Addison had to look up to plunge them into his chocolate irises, inhaled his comforting scent, and gave him a smile, which he returned. Wyatt leaned in a bit more, his breath lightly caressing the young girl's lips, who blushed and couldn't help but look down to those warm lips that seemed to call to her. But the wolf lifted his head a little and kissed her on the forehead, before hugging her more tightly. Addison sighed in happiness. Despite the final tone of the evening, her gaze was once again drawn to the bluish glow of the Moonstone. A sense of well-being spread throughout her body, before she froze as she saw a dark form dancing languidly to the sound of the music. Maybe this story wasn't that finished after all.